The scream died in her throat the moment the bullet tore through her father's chest, and when Meredith Owens opened her mouth to cry out again, nothing emerged but hollow, desperate silence. She had been 20 years old for exactly 3 weeks when the Davis gang rode into their homestead outside Randsburg, California on that scorching August evening in 1878. Her father, Samuel Owens, had been watering the horses. Her mother, Catherine, had been setting the supper table. Meredith had been hanging laundry, her hands still damp from wringing out her father's work shirts when she heard the thunder of hooves approaching too fast, too purposeful. By the time she turned toward the house, everything she knew was ending. They wanted the deed to the silver claim her father had registered 3 months prior. Samuel Owens refused. The leader, a man with dead eyes and a smile like a knife wound, shot him where he stood. Catherine ran for the rifle above the mantel. She never reached it. Meredith watched her mother fall, watched the light leave her eyes, watched the pool of blood spread across the pine floorboards she had helped her mother scrub that very morning. Meredith tried to scream. The sound caught in her throat like a bird with broken wings, fluttering and failing and finally dying there. She tried again. Nothing. The gang members ransacked the house, found the deed, and rode away as the sun set fire to the western sky, leaving her alone with 2 bodies and a voice that had vanished as completely as her family. The next 3 days blurred together in a fog of shock and grief. Neighbors found her sitting between her parents' graves, her hands still blistered from digging in the hard California earth. Mrs. Henderson tried to coax words from her, then sounds, then even a whisper. Nothing came. The doctor in Randsburg examined her throat, found no physical damage, and shook his head. "The mind can do strange things when the heart breaks," he said, as if that explained anything at all. Meredith sold the homestead for a fraction of its worth. She could not bear to stay where ghosts walked in every corner, where her mother's blood had seeped between the floorboards, where her father's empty chair sat at the table like an accusation. With the money and what little she could carry, she took the stage north toward the mining camps, thinking perhaps she could disappear into the roughness of the frontier, become as silent on the outside as she had become on the inside. The stage let her off in a dusty crossroads called Cerro Gordo in early September, where the air smelled of sage and silver ore, and men outnumbered women 20 to 1. She found work at the boarding house run by a widow named Pearl Hutchinson, a weathered woman with kind eyes and questions she thankfully did not voice when Meredith communicated only through nods and the slate board she carried everywhere. For 2 months, Meredith existed in her silence. She scrubbed floors and changed linens and served meals to miners who sometimes tried to talk to her, then gave up when she only responded with written words or gestures. Some thought her simple. Others thought her stuck up. Most simply forgot she was there, which suited her fine. She had learned that silence made her invisible, and invisibility felt safer than being seen. Then winter came early to the high desert, and with it came a cowboy named Thomas Jensen. He arrived on a November afternoon when the wind carried the promise of rare snow, riding a paint horse that looked as travel-worn as its rider. Meredith was sweeping the boarding house porch when he dismounted, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had spent too many days in the saddle. He was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and hair the color of desert sand. When he looked up at her, she was struck by his eyes, green as spring grass in a land that knew mostly browns and golds. "Afternoon, miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was low and rough, like wind across stone. "Mrs. Hutchinson have any rooms available?" Meredith nodded and gestured toward the door, then pointed to herself and mimed writing. Most men would have looked confused or impatient. Thomas Jensen simply nodded once, as if she had spoken perfect sense, and waited while she pulled her slate from her apron pocket and wrote, "Yes, come inside." He read it without reaction, without pity or curiosity or any of the usual responses. "Much obliged," he said, and followed her into the boarding house. Mrs. Hutchinson emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. "Help you, sir. Need a room for a month, maybe longer. I am working a contract at the mine. $3 a week includes breakfast and supper. No drinking, no fighting, no women in the rooms." "Yes, madam." He counted out coins from a worn leather pouch. "I am a quiet lodger. Good." Mrs. Hutchinson took the money and handed him a key. "Meredith here will show you up. Room 4, top of the stairs on the left." Meredith led him up the narrow staircase, acutely aware of his presence behind her, the creak of his boots on the old wood, the smell of horse and leather and desert that clung to him. She unlocked the door to a small, clean room with a bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. He set his saddlebags on the bed and turned to her. "Thank you, miss. What was your name again?" "Meredith," she nodded. "I am Thomas Jensen." He paused, studying her with those unsettling green eyes. "You do not talk, or you cannot talk." Most people never asked. They just assumed. Meredith pulled out her slate and wrote carefully, "Cannot, not since August." He read it and nodded slowly. "That is recent then. I am sorry for whatever took it from you." Something in his tone, the simple acknowledgement without pressing for details, made her throat tighten with the phantom of tears. She managed a small nod and turned to leave. "Meredith," he said, and she paused in the doorway. Silence is not always a bad thing. Sometimes it is the only honest response to a dishonest world. She looked back at him, startled, but he had already turned to unpack his saddlebags. She left, closing the door softly behind her, and wondered what kind of man spoke about silence like he understood it from the inside. Over the following days, she learned that Thomas Jensen was unlike any man she had encountered in the mining camp. He rose early and returned late, his hands and face dusty from the silver mine, but he always nodded to her when their paths crossed, always treated her like she was fully present rather than half erased. He never tried to make her talk, never treated her slate as anything unusual. Other boarders would shout across the dining room, demanding more coffee or complaining about the food. Thomas caught her eye and pointed to his empty cup, a question in the gesture rather than a command. When she poured, he nodded his thanks. When other men tried to engage him in the crude talk that flowed as freely as whiskey on Saturday nights, he demurred quietly and took his meals in near silence. "That Jensen fellow is an odd one," Mrs. Hutchinson remarked one evening as they washed dishes together. "Polite as Sunday church, but does not say 3 words if 2 will do." Meredith smiled slightly and wrote on her slate, "Maybe he understands that words are not always necessary." Mrs. Hutchinson read it and laughed. "Maybe you two are cut from the same quiet cloth." But Meredith noticed that Thomas was not simply quiet. He was watchful. He paid attention in a way most people did not, reading the room like some men read newspapers. He noticed when Mrs. Hutchinson's rheumatism made her wince and quietly carried the heavy water buckets without being asked. He noticed when one of the miners got too drunk and aggressive, and stood between the man and his target with a calm presence that diffused the situation without violence. And he noticed her. Not in the leering way some men did, but with an attentiveness that felt like being truly seen for the first time since that terrible August night. 3 weeks after his arrival, the first snow came. It was a rare event in the high desert, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost beautiful. Meredith stood on the back porch after breakfast, watching the fat flakes fall, remembering how she and her mother used to catch snow on their tongues during the occasional winter storms. "Beautiful, is it not?" She jumped slightly. Thomas had emerged from the boarding house pulling on his work gloves. He came to stand beside her, not too close, respecting the distance she maintained with everyone. She nodded and wrote on her slate, "We rarely get snow here." "Same where I grew up, Texas Panhandle. When it did snow, my mother would make snow cream with canned milk and sugar." He smiled slightly, a rare expression that softened his weathered features. "I have not thought about that in years," she wrote. "Good memory." "One of the few," he said, and something in his tone suggested depth she could not fathom. Then he touched his hat. "I better get to the mine before the foreman has my hide. You stay warm, Meredith." She watched him walk into the falling snow, his shoulders squared against the cold, and felt something shift in her chest. It was not quite warmth, not yet, but it was the first thing besides grief she had felt in months. That evening, Thomas did not return for supper. The snow had intensified, transforming from a gentle fall into a proper storm. Mrs. Hutchinson fretted at the window. "The mine should have let them leave early. This weather is not fit for traveling." By 9 o'clock, most of the boarders had retired to their rooms, driven by the early darkness and the cold that seeped through every crack. Meredith was banking the fire in the parlor stove when she heard the front door open with a gust of wind and snow. Thomas stumbled inside, and even in the dim lamplight she could see something was wrong. He was holding his left arm close to his body, and his face was gray beneath the coating of snow. She rushed to him, and he tried to wave her off. "I am fine. Just a stupid accident." Timber shifted, caught my arm. Meredith pointed firmly at the nearest chair. He sank into it with a barely suppressed groan. She lit more lamps and gently moved his hand away from his arm. His coat sleeve was torn, and blood had soaked through his shirt beneath. She looked at him with wide, frightened eyes and reached for her slate, but he caught her hand. "Do not fetch Mrs. Hutchinson. She will want to send for the doctor, and I cannot afford that. It is not as bad as it looks." Meredith shook her head emphatically and pulled her hand free, writing quickly, "It needs cleaning at minimum. Let me help." He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. "All right." She heated water and gathered clean cloths and the bottle of whiskey Mrs. Hutchinson kept for medicinal purposes. Thomas removed his coat and shirt with gritted teeth, revealing an ugly gash along his forearm, still bleeding sluggishly. Meredith carefully cleaned the wound, her hand steady despite her racing heart. She had helped her mother tend injuries before, back when she had a voice and a family and a life that made sense. Thomas watched her work, his jaw tight, but he did not flinch even when she poured whiskey over the wound to disinfect it. "You have done this before," he observed. She nodded and wrote one-handed while keeping pressure on the wound. "My mother taught me." "She taught you well." He paused. "Is she in Randsburg, your family?" Meredith's hand stilled. She had not spoken of, or rather written of, that night to anyone. The weight of it sat in her chest like a stone, growing heavier with every day of silence. But something about Thomas, about the way he sat there bleeding and patient, made her want to try. She wrote slowly, "They died 3 months ago, both of them. I was there." Thomas read the words, and his expression shifted into something that looked like understanding and grief combined. "That is when you lost your voice." It was not a question, but she nodded anyway. Then, because the silence suddenly felt like it was choking her again, she wrote more. "Men came to our homestead. They wanted our silver claim. My father refused. They killed him. Then my mother. I tried to scream and nothing came out. Nothing has come out since." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and Meredith braced herself for the platitudes, the hollow comfort, the useless reassurances that meant nothing. Instead, he said, I am sorry. Not sorry in the way people say when they do not know what else to say. Sorry because I know what it is to watch people you love die and be powerless to stop it. She looked up at him, her hand still pressed against his bandaged arm, and saw truth in his eyes. I had a wife, he said quietly, and a baby daughter. 3 years ago, cholera swept through our town. I was away, working a cattle drive. By the time I got back, they had been dead for 2 weeks. My wife's last letter said the baby was teething, keeping her up at nights. That was the last thing I knew about them while they were still alive. Meredith's breath caught. She reached for her slate with shaking hands and wrote, I am so sorry. Me too. He looked down at his bandaged arm. I think grief does things to people, changes them in ways that do not always make sense. Your voice locked up. Mine just sort of emptied out. I can talk, but most of the time I do not have much to say. Seems like the things worth saying died with them. She wrote, but you said something to me that first day about silence being honest. Because it is, he said, and because I recognized something in you. The look of someone trying to survive a wound that does not show. They sat there in the quiet boarding house parlor, the snow falling outside, 2 broken people acknowledging each other's brokenness. Meredith felt something crack open inside her, something that had been sealed tight since that August night. Not healing, not yet, but the first painful possibility of it, she wrote. Thank you for telling me about your family. Thank you for tending my arm. He stood carefully, testing his balance. I should get to bed before Mrs. Hutchinson discovers I am bleeding all over her furniture. Meredith smiled, a real smile, small but genuine. She walked him to the stairs and watched him climb them slowly, favoring his injured arm. At the top, he turned back. Meredith, he said, your voice might come back someday or it might not, but either way, I hear you just fine. She pressed her hand to her chest over her heart and nodded. He returned the gesture and disappeared into the dark hallway. That night, Meredith lay awake in her small room off the kitchen, listening to the wind howl around the eaves. For the first time since her parents died, she felt less alone. Thomas carried his own ghosts, his own silence. He understood hers not because he pitied her, but because he recognized it. In the strange arithmetic of grief, that recognition felt like the beginning of something. She did not have a word for it yet, but it was there, small and tentative and real. The next morning, Thomas's arm was swollen and hot to the touch. Mrs. Hutchinson took one look at him over breakfast and declared he was not going anywhere. That wound is infected, Mr. Jensen. You will stay in bed, and Meredith will bring you broth and willow bark tea until the fever breaks. Thomas tried to protest, but Mrs. Hutchinson was a force of nature when it came to caring for her boarders. He retreated to his room, and Meredith found herself climbing the stairs with tea and soup 3 times that day. He slept fitfully, his fever climbing as the day wore on. By evening he was mumbling in his sleep, fragments of words that sounded like names. Caroline, he whispered. Lily, I am sorry, I should have been there. Meredith sat beside his bed, cooling his forehead with damp cloths, her heart aching for this man who carried his losses like she carried hers. When his fever finally broke near midnight, he opened his eyes and looked at her with confusion. You have been here all night, he said, his voice hoarse. She nodded and showed him her slate. Someone had to make sure you did not do something stupid like die, he laughed weakly. Would have been inconvenient, she wrote. Very. Mrs. Hutchinson would have been quite annoyed about the mess. His laugh turned into a cough, and she helped him sit up to drink water. His hand, when it gripped hers for support, was still too warm but no longer burning. He would recover. Why did you stay? He asked when he could breathe again. She considered the question, then wrote carefully. Because you saw me when I was invisible, because you told me your ghosts, because I think we understand each other." He read her words slowly, then looked up at her with an expression she could not quite name. "I think we do," he said softly. She stayed until he fell asleep again, this time peacefully, and walked back to her room as dawn was breaking. Something had shifted between them in the long hours of the night. The distance they had both maintained, the careful politeness, had worn thin. What lay beneath was still frightening, but it was also the first thing that had felt like hope in a very long time. Thomas recovered over the following week, though Mrs. Hutchinson forbade him from returning to the mine until the wound had properly closed. He spent his days in the parlor, reading old newspapers and helping with small tasks that did not require his left arm. Meredith found herself drawn to the parlor more often than necessary, and if Thomas noticed, he did not comment. They developed a comfortable pattern of communication. She would write something on her slate, he would respond aloud, and somehow it worked better than most conversations she had witnessed. One afternoon she wrote, "Do you miss Texas?" "Sometimes," he said, looking up from his newspaper. "I miss the space of it. The way you could ride for days and never see the same horizon twice. But mostly what I miss is gone now. The Texas I knew does not exist anymore, at least not for me," she wrote. "Because of your wife and daughter, Caroline and Lily," he said, speaking their names like a prayer. "Yes. We had a small ranch near Amarillo. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. After they died, I sold it. Could not stand to be there without them. Have been drifting ever since. Taking work where I can find it, moving when the memories get too loud." "Does moving help?" "Not really," he admitted. "The memories follow. But at least new places do not have specific ghosts. I do not walk past the tree where I buried them every day. I do not see Lily's empty cradle in the corner. Small mercies." Meredith wrote, "I understand. That is why I left Randsburg. Everything there had blood on it." Thomas reached across the small table between them and took her slate, reading her words carefully. Then he looked at her with such understanding that she felt tears prick her eyes. "We are a pair, are we not?" he said gently. "Two people running from the same thing." She nodded, and a tear escaped despite her best efforts. Thomas pulled out a clean handkerchief and handed it to her. She dabbed at her eyes, frustrated by her own emotion, by the words that still would not come even though she desperately wanted to tell him everything. "You do not have to explain," Thomas said, as if reading her mind. "I see it, Meredith. I see your grief. You do not need words for me to understand it." She wrote through her tears. "Sometimes I think the silence will swallow me whole. I have so much inside and no way to let it out." "Then write it," he said simply. "Not on your slate, in a journal. Write everything you cannot say, the anger, the fear, the memories. Get them out of your head and onto paper. It is not the same as speaking, but it is something." She had not thought of that. The slate was for communication, quick messages and practical necessities. But writing for herself, for the sole purpose of release, that was different. "I do not have a journal," she wrote. "Then we will get you one," Thomas said decisively. "There is a general store down the street. They must have blank books." The next day, despite Mrs. Hutchinson's protests that his arm was not fully healed, Thomas walked with Meredith to the general store. The December air was cold but dry, the snow from weeks before long melted. The store was cramped and dusty, smelling of tobacco and old leather, but the proprietor produced 3 blank journals from beneath the counter. "For keeping accounts," he said. "But I suppose they work for whatever you need writing for." Thomas bought her the nicest one, bound in soft brown leather with pages that felt smooth beneath her fingers. "For your words," he said when she tried to protest the expense. "The ones you cannot speak yet." Back at the boarding house, Meredith sat at the small desk in her room and opened the journal. For a long moment, she just stared at the blank page, overwhelmed by its emptiness. Then she picked up her pen and began to write. My name is Meredith Owens. I am 20 years old. 3 months ago, I watched my parents die. The men who killed them took everything, my family, my home, my voice. I have been silent since that night, locked inside myself, invisible and alone, until Thomas Jensen arrived. He sees me. He understands. And for the first time since I lost everything, I think I might survive this. The words poured out of her, page after page, everything she had kept locked inside. She wrote about the homestead, about hanging laundry while her world ended. She wrote about the sound her mother made when she fell, about the way her father's blood looked almost black in the fading light. She wrote about the moment her scream died in her throat, about the terrible silence that followed. She wrote until her hand cramped and tears blurred the pages. When she finally stopped, it was full dark outside and someone was knocking softly on her door. Thomas stood in the hallway, holding a plate of food. Mrs. Hutchinson said you missed supper. Thought you might be hungry. Meredith took the plate with shaking hands and gestured for him to come in. He hesitated, mindful of propriety, but she insisted. He entered her small room and saw the journal open on her desk, pages filled with her slanted handwriting. You wrote, he said, and there was something like pride in his voice. She nodded and quickly scrawled on her slate. I could not stop. Everything just came out. Good, he said firmly. That is exactly what should happen. Keep writing, Meredith, every day, even if it is just a few lines. Give your words somewhere to live since they cannot come out your mouth yet, she wrote. Thank you for the journal, for understanding. You do not have to thank me, Thomas said. We are helping each other. That is what people do when they recognize their own pain in someone else. He left her to eat her supper, but the warmth of his words stayed with her. That night, she wrote more, and the next day and the day after that. The journal became her voice in a way the slate never had. On the slate, she was practical and brief. In the journal, she was everything she could not say aloud, raw and honest and broken and slowly, painfully beginning to heal. Christmas came and went quietly. Mrs. Hutchinson made a feast, and the boarders sang carols with varying degrees of skill. Meredith sat beside Thomas, listening to his surprisingly good baritone, and felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in her chest. When he caught her watching him, he smiled and she felt her face heat. After the meal, Thomas asked if she wanted to take a walk. The night was cold but clear, stars blazing in the desert sky like diamonds scattered across black velvet. They walked the quiet streets of Cerro Gordo, their breath making clouds in the frozen air. Thomas pointed to the sky. My father taught me the constellations. That is Orion, the hunter, and there, that is Cassiopeia. Caroline loved the stars. She used to say they were proof that beautiful things could exist in the dark. Meredith pulled out her slate, difficult with her gloved hands, and wrote. She was right. They are beautiful. So is tonight, Thomas said, looking at her rather than the sky. So is the company. Meredith felt her breath catch. The way he looked at her, warm and intent, made her feel things she thought had died with her parents. She had not imagined she could feel anything like this again, this flutter of nerves and hope and terrifying possibility. She wrote, her hand trembling slightly. I enjoy your company too. Meredith, Thomas said carefully, I need to tell you something, and I need you to be honest with me afterward. Can you do that? She nodded, her heart pounding. I have not felt anything, really felt anything, since Caroline and Lily died. I have been moving through the world like a ghost, just going through motions. But you make me feel things again. When you smile, which is rare and therefore precious. When you write something witty on your slate. When you sit quietly in the same room and I know you are there. I feel, and it scares the hell out of me because I did not think I would ever feel again, and I am not sure I deserve to. Meredith's throat tightened with phantom emotion. She wrote quickly, "I feel the same way, scared. But also, for the first time since August, like I might be more than just broken." Thomas read her words in the starlight, then gently took the slate from her hands and set it aside. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch warm through her cold skin. "You are not broken," he said fiercely. "You are wounded. There is a difference. Broken things cannot heal. Wounded things can, given time and care and the right person to help them." Meredith reached up and covered his hands with hers, tears streaming down her face. In the silent language they had developed, the gesture said everything. Yes. This. You. Us. Thomas pulled her into his arms, and she buried her face in his chest, feeling his heart beat steady and strong beneath her ear. They stood like that for a long time, two people who had lost everything finding something new in each other. When they finally walked back to the boarding house, Thomas held her hand, and Meredith thought that maybe, just maybe, she was going to be all right. The new year arrived with unexpected warmth, a January thaw that turned the roads to mud and made everyone restless for spring. Thomas returned to work at the mine, his arm fully healed, but his evenings belonged to Meredith. They fell into a routine that felt almost like courtship, though neither of them named it that. He would finish supper and find her in the kitchen or the parlor, and they would sit together, talking in their unique way. She wrote, he spoke, and somehow it worked perfectly. Mrs. Hutchinson noticed, of course. "That Jensen fellow is sweet on you," she told Meredith one morning while they kneaded bread, "and unless I am very much mistaken, you feel the same." Meredith felt her face flush, but she nodded. "Good," Mrs. Hutchinson said firmly. "He is a good man, and Lord knows you deserve some happiness after what you have been through. Just mind the proprieties. I will not have talk about my boarding house." Meredith nodded again, grateful for the older woman's understanding. She wrote on her flour-dusted slate, "He is a good man. He understands me." "That is worth more than gold," Mrs. Hutchinson said, punching down the dough with vigor. "Plenty of men will sweet-talk a woman, but understanding, that is rare as hen's teeth." That evening, Thomas asked Meredith if she would like to go riding the next Sunday. "I need to check on my horse anyway. She has been eating her head off at the livery stable, and I thought you might enjoy getting out of town for a bit." Meredith wrote enthusiastically, "Yes. I have not ridden since I left Randsburg." Sunday dawned clear and mild, a perfect day for riding. Thomas borrowed a gentle mare for Meredith, and they rode out into the desert hills, following old trails through sage and creosote. The land was harsh but beautiful, all long vistas and endless sky. Meredith felt something loosen in her chest, the constant tension she carried easing slightly in the open air. They stopped beside a seasonal creek, dry now but lined with cottonwoods that would be green come spring. Thomas helped her dismount, his hands steady on her waist, and they sat on a flat rock to share the lunch Mrs. Hutchinson had packed. "I have been thinking," Thomas said as they ate. "My contract at the mine ends in March. I will need to decide what comes next." Meredith's heart sank. She wrote, "Will you leave?" "That depends," he said carefully. "I have been drifting for 3 years, never staying anywhere longer than a few months, but Cerro Gordo feels different. It feels like maybe I could stop drifting if I had a reason to." She wrote with shaking hands. "What kind of reason?" Thomas set down his sandwich and turned to face her fully. "The kind where I court you properly, with intention. The kind where I ask Mrs. Hutchinson's permission to walk out with you officially. The kind where I stay and build something instead of running from what I lost." Meredith stared at him, her eyes wide. She wrote, "You want to court me, officially?" "I do," Thomas said. "If you will have me. I know I am not much of a catch. I am a widower with more ghosts than prospects." I work with my hands and do not have much saved, but I care for you, Meredith, more than I thought I could care for anyone again. You make me want to stop running and start living." Tears spilled down Meredith's cheeks. She wrote frantically, "Yes, yes, I will have you. I care for you too. So much it frightens me." "It frightens me too," Thomas admitted. "Caring about someone again means risking loss again, but I think the risk is worth it. I think you are worth it." He wiped the tears from her face with his thumbs, then leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. She did not. When his lips met hers, gentle and questioning, she kissed him back with all the words she could not speak, all the emotion that had nowhere else to go. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "That was, you are, God, I am making a mess of this." Meredith laughed silently, her shoulders shaking, and wrote, "You are doing fine. Better than fine." They rode back to Cerro Gordo as the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose. Thomas held her hand as they walked the horses up the main street, a public declaration that made Meredith's heart race. By morning, everyone in the small mining camp would know that Thomas Jensen was courting the silent girl from Mrs. Hutchinson's boarding house. Let them talk, Meredith thought. She had found something real and good in the wreckage of her grief, and she was not about to let it go. True to his word, Thomas asked Mrs. Hutchinson's permission to formally court Meredith. The older woman gave her blessing with enthusiasm, only cautioning them to move slowly and respect proper behavior. Over the following weeks, their courtship became the talk of Cerro Gordo, mostly because it was so unlike typical frontier romances. There was no wild passion or hasty decisions, just two people slowly learning to trust again. Thomas brought her small gifts: a hair ribbon from the general store, a smooth stone he found that was the exact color of her eyes, a book of poetry he thought she would enjoy. Meredith baked him pies and mended his shirts and wrote him notes that he folded carefully and kept in his pocket. They talked, in their way, about everything. Thomas told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to rope cattle from his father, about meeting Caroline at a church social, and knowing immediately she was the one. Meredith wrote about her childhood in Randsburg, about her father teaching her to pan for gold in the creek, about her mother's flower garden that somehow thrived in the desert. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk about the future. Not in concrete terms, not yet, but in possibilities. Thomas mentioned he had always wanted to run his own ranch again, something small and manageable. Meredith wrote that she had always loved the idea of a real home, a place that was truly hers. "We could have that," Thomas said one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch watching the stars. "A home together if you wanted." Meredith wrote, "Is that a proposal?" "Not yet," Thomas said, smiling. "When I propose, you will know it. This is just me thinking out loud about the kind of life I want. A life with you in it," she wrote. "I want that too, a life with you, a home. Maybe even, eventually, a family." Thomas's expression turned serious. "I would love that, truly. But I need you to know, if your voice never comes back, it does not matter to me. I will love you silent or speaking. That is not what I fell in love with." Meredith's breath caught. It was the first time either of them had used the word love. She wrote with trembling hands, "You love me." "I do," Thomas said simply. "I love your strength and your resilience. I love the way you listen, really listen, because you cannot interrupt with your own words. I love your quiet laugh and the way you bite your lip when you are thinking. I love all of you, Meredith, voice or no voice." She set down her slate and threw her arms around his neck, holding him tight. Against his shoulder, she mouthed the words she could not speak. "I love you too." He understood. He always understood. February brought rain to the high desert, rare and precious. The hills turned green almost overnight, wildflowers appearing in impossible profusion. Thomas and Meredith walked through fields of poppies and lupines, and she filled her journal with descriptions of the colors, trying to capture the beauty before it faded. One evening, Thomas came to supper with an unusual expression, excitement and nervousness mixed together. After the meal, he pulled Meredith aside. "I have something to show you. Can you come with me?" She nodded, curious, and followed him out into the soft spring evening. He led her to the livery stable, where his horse was saddled and waiting along with the gentle mare Meredith usually rode. "Where are we going?" she wrote. "You will see," he said with a mysterious smile. They rode out of town as the sun set, heading east into the hills. After about 30 minutes, Thomas turned down a narrow track Meredith had never noticed before. It led to a small valley, sheltered by rocky bluffs where a creek ran year-round through cottonwoods and willows. In the center of the valley stood a small house, old but solid, with a barn and a corral. Thomas dismounted and helped Meredith down. "This place belongs to an old prospector named Henry Mathers. He is getting too old to work it and wants to sell. I came out to look at it yesterday, and I cannot stop thinking about it." Meredith looked around, seeing the potential beneath the neglect. The house needed work, and the barn was listing slightly, but the bones were good. The land was beautiful, green now with spring rains, and the water was invaluable in this dry country, she wrote. "It is perfect, but can you afford it?" "Just barely," Thomas admitted. "I have been saving every penny from the mine work. Henry is willing to let me pay over time since I would be improving the place. It is not much, but it could be ours, Meredith. A real home, not a boarding house room, a place to build a life," she wrote. "Ours, you mean together?" Thomas took both her hands in his. In the fading light, his eyes were very green and very serious. "Meredith Owens, I know it has only been a few months. I know people will say we are rushing, but I have already lost one family to waiting too long, to assuming there would always be more time. I do not want to waste another moment. Will you marry me? Will you help me turn this worn-out old place into a home and build a life here together?" Meredith's vision blurred with tears. She nodded frantically, then realized he could not take that as a proper answer. She pulled out her slate and wrote in large letters, "Yes, yes, I will marry you." Thomas laughed and picked her up, spinning her around while she held on tight. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, and she kissed him back, pouring every ounce of love and joy and hope into it. "We will get married as soon as possible," Thomas said when they came up for air. "I will talk to the preacher tomorrow, and then we will buy this place from Henry and start fixing it up, together." Meredith wrote, "Mrs. Hutchinson will be thrilled. She loves weddings." "Everyone loves weddings," Thomas said. "Especially in a mining camp where the entertainment options are limited. We will probably have the whole town in attendance." He was right. When they announced their engagement the next day, Cerro Gordo erupted in excitement. Mrs. Hutchinson cried and hugged them both. The other boarders congratulated Thomas with hearty handshakes and knowing grins. The ladies of the town, all 5 of them, descended on Meredith to discuss dress fabric and flowers and food. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in March, giving them just 3 weeks to prepare. Meredith felt swept up in a whirlwind of activity. Mrs. Hutchinson and the other women helped her sew a dress from pale blue calico, the nicest fabric the general store had in stock. Thomas bought the property from Henry Mathers and spent every spare moment working on the house, determined to make it livable for his bride. Meredith split her time between helping prepare for the wedding and writing in her journal. She poured out her feelings, the strange mixture of joy and lingering grief. "I wish my parents could see this," she wrote. I wish my mother could help me with my dress and my father could walk me down the aisle, but I think they would be happy for me. They would approve of Thomas. He is a good man, the kind of man my father was, and I know they would want me to live, not just survive. The night before the wedding, Meredith lay awake in her small room off the kitchen, trying to quiet her racing thoughts. She was getting married tomorrow, starting a new life. It felt impossible and inevitable at the same time. There was a soft knock on her door. She opened it to find Mrs. Hutchinson holding a cup of chamomile tea. Thought you might need this. Could not sleep before my wedding either. Meredith smiled and let her in. They sat on the narrow bed, sipping tea in comfortable silence. Finally, Mrs. Hutchinson spoke. You are a brave girl, Meredith. Braver than you know. You lost everything, but you did not let it destroy you. You found a way to keep living, keep feeling. That takes real courage. Meredith pulled out her ever-present slate and wrote, I had help. Thomas helped, you helped. I could not have done it alone. Maybe not, Mrs. Hutchinson agreed. But you did the hard work yourself. You chose to heal instead of staying broken. You chose to love again instead of closing yourself off. Those were your choices, and they were brave ones. Meredith felt tears prick her eyes. She wrote, I am scared. What if I cannot be a good wife? What if my voice never comes back? Then you will figure it out together, Mrs. Hutchinson said firmly. That is what marriage is, figuring things out together. And as for your voice, well, Thomas fell in love with you exactly as you are. If it comes back, wonderful. If not, you two have already proven you can communicate just fine. Thank you, Meredith wrote. For everything. For taking me in, for helping me, for being like family. Mrs. Hutchinson pulled her into a hug. You are like family, dear girl, and I am so happy you found your happiness. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, spring warmth returning after a week of cool weather. Meredith dressed carefully in her new blue dress, her hair pinned up with the ivory combs Mrs. Hutchinson had lent her. She looked at herself in the small mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Gone was the hollow-eyed girl who had arrived in Cerro Gordo 6 months ago. In her place was someone who looked almost happy, almost whole. The ceremony was held at the small church on the edge of town, packed with miners and townspeople who wanted to witness the wedding. Thomas stood at the front in his best shirt, looking nervous and handsome. When Meredith walked down the aisle on Mrs. Hutchinson's arm, his face lit up with such love that she felt her eyes sting with tears. The preacher kept the ceremony short, aware that the bride could not speak her vows. He had them both write their promises instead. Thomas wrote his quickly, his hand steady. I promise to love you, honor you, and stand beside you all the days of my life. Meredith's hands shook as she wrote. I promise to love you, trust you, and build a life with you today and always. They exchanged simple gold bands that Thomas had ordered from a jeweler in the larger town of Lone Pine. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her gently, and the church erupted in applause. The reception was held at the boarding house, with food contributions from everyone in town. There was dancing and singing and more laughter than Meredith had heard in months. She danced with Thomas, his arm strong around her waist, and felt happier than she had thought possible. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Thomas leaned close and whispered, Ready to go home, Mrs. Jensen, Mrs. Jensen. Her new name. Her new life. She nodded eagerly. They rode out to their little valley under the stars, Thomas leading the way with confidence despite the darkness. The house glowed with lamplight. Thomas had ridden out earlier to prepare it. He helped her down from her horse and, in a gesture that made her heart swell, picked her up and carried her over the threshold. Inside, the house was clean and neat, a fire burning in the hearth. Thomas had brought some furniture from the boarding house, enough to make the place livable. There was a real bed, a table and chairs, a stove for cooking. It was sparse, but it was theirs. "Welcome home," Thomas said, setting her gently on her feet. Meredith looked around their home, then up at her husband, and felt such overwhelming love that she thought her chest might burst with it. She pulled out her slate and wrote, "It is perfect. You are perfect. This is everything I never thought I would have again." Thomas read her words, then set the slate aside and cupped her face in his hands. "You are my everything, Meredith, my second chance, my hope, my home." He kissed her deeply, and she wrapped her arms around him, holding tight. They had both lost so much, both been broken by grief and loss. But together, in this small house in this hidden valley, they were beginning to heal. They were building something new from the ruins of what they had lost. That night, as they lay tangled together in their marriage bed, Thomas whispered, "I love you," into her hair, and Meredith mouthed the words back against his chest, trusting that he would understand. He always understood. The first months of marriage were a blur of hard work and quiet contentment. Thomas continued working at the mine to bring in steady money while they fixed up the ranch. Meredith threw herself into making the house a home, scrubbing and painting and sewing curtains for the windows. In the evenings, they worked together on the bigger projects, mending the barn roof, reinforcing the corral fence, planting a vegetable garden. It was exhausting work, but satisfying in a way Meredith had not experienced before. Every improvement they made was theirs, built by their own hands. The ranch was coming back to life under their care, and so were they. They fell into comfortable routines, learning each other's rhythms and habits. Thomas woke early and made coffee while Meredith dressed. She packed his lunch while he fed the horses. In the evenings, he helped with supper, and afterward they sat on the porch watching the sunset, talking in their unique way about their days, their plans, their dreams. Meredith continued writing in her journal, but the entries changed. She still wrote about her parents sometimes, about the grief that would probably always be part of her. But increasingly, she wrote about joy, about Thomas making her laugh with his dry humor, about the satisfaction of seeing their garden sprout, about the quiet contentment of falling asleep in her husband's arms. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch in the cooling air, Thomas said, "I have been thinking about expanding, maybe getting some cattle. We have good grazing here and the water is reliable. We could start small, just a dozen head, and build from there." Meredith considered this and wrote, "That would mean you could quit the mine eventually, work our own land full-time." "Exactly," Thomas said. "I hate being away from you all day. I want to build this place into something that can support us both, something we can pass down someday." She wrote, "To our children." Thomas smiled. "That is the idea, yes, if we are blessed with them." Meredith set down her slate and took his hand, placing it over her stomach. His eyes widened. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" he asked, his voice hushed with wonder. She nodded, smiling through sudden tears. She had missed her monthly courses twice now and had been feeling strange in the mornings. She was almost certain, though she had not yet seen a doctor to confirm it. Thomas let out a whoop of joy and pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was precious and fragile. "We are going to have a baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Meredith, we are going to be parents." She nodded against his chest, crying now, overwhelmed by happiness and fear in equal measure. Thomas pulled back to look at her face, wiping away her tears. "I know it is scary," he said softly. "I am scared too, but we will figure it out together, and this baby will be so loved, Meredith. So incredibly loved." She wrote with shaking hands, "I wish I could tell you properly, with my voice. This news deserves more than writing." "Your silence has never diminished anything you have said to me," Thomas said firmly. "You told me you love me without words." You told me you would marry me without words. And you just told me we are having a child without words. I hear you perfectly, Meredith. I always have." That night, they lay in bed talking late into the evening. Thomas's hand rested on her still flat stomach, and they made plans for their growing family. They would need to add a room to the house, make a proper nursery. Thomas would need to finish fixing the barn before winter came. They would need to find a midwife, make sure Meredith had proper care. "What do you hope for?" Thomas asked. "A boy or a girl?" Meredith reached for the slate she kept beside the bed and wrote, "I do not care, just healthy." "What about you?" "Same," Thomas said. "Though I admit the idea of a daughter makes me happy. I lost Lily so young she was barely more than a baby. I would like the chance to raise a girl to watch her grow up." Meredith understood. A child could not replace the ones he had lost, but it could help heal those old wounds. She wrote, "And if it is a boy?" "Then I will be thrilled," Thomas said immediately. "I will teach him to ride and rope and be a good man like his grandfather Owens, from what you have told me." The mention of her father made Meredith's eyes sting. She wrote, "I wish my parents could meet their grandchild. I wish they could see that I am happy again, that I found love and a home." "I think they know," Thomas said gently. "Wherever they are, I think they know you survived and found happiness. That is what parents want for their children." Meredith hoped he was right. She closed her eyes and imagined telling her mother about the baby, imagined her father's pride at becoming a grandfather. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had softened around the edges. Life was moving forward, carrying her with it. Summer arrived in full force, turning the valley gold and dry. Meredith's pregnancy became obvious, her belly rounding beneath her dresses. The midwife from Cerro Gordo, a capable woman named Sarah Brennan, came out to examine her and pronounced everything normal and healthy. "Baby should come in January," Sarah said. "You are young and strong. I do not anticipate any problems, but I will check on you monthly and more often as you get closer." Thomas bought 6 cows with calves from a neighboring ranch, starting their herd. He spent his days building fence and improving pasture, transforming himself from a mine worker back into a rancher. He was happier than Meredith had ever seen him, coming in each evening tired and dusty, but smiling. One afternoon in August, exactly a year after her parents' deaths, Meredith walked out to the small rise behind their house. She carried 2 wooden crosses that Thomas had made for her. Together, they planted the crosses in the rocky soil, creating a memorial for Samuel and Catherine Owens. Meredith stood before the crosses for a long time, one hand on her growing belly. She wished she could speak, could say proper words for her parents. Instead, she spoke to them in her heart, telling them about Thomas and the baby and the life she was building from the ashes of what she had lost. Thomas came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers. "They would be proud of you," he said quietly. "The way you survived, the way you healed, the way you chose to keep living." Meredith nodded, tears streaming down her face. She leaned against her husband, drawing strength from his solid presence, and said a silent goodbye to the girl she had been. That Meredith, the one who had a voice and a family and a different life, was gone. But this Meredith, silent and scarred but healing, was building something good. Something worth living for. As fall arrived, painting the cottonwoods gold, Meredith nested with increasing urgency. She sewed baby clothes from soft cotton, made tiny blankets and gowns. Thomas added a small room to the house for the nursery, putting in a window that faced east to catch the morning sun. They bought a cradle from a furniture maker in Lone Pine, and Thomas spent an entire evening sanding it smooth, making sure there were no rough edges that could harm their child. "I am terrified," Thomas admitted one night as they lay in bed, his hand on her belly feeling the baby kick. What if I am not a good father? What if I cannot protect this child the way I could not protect Lily? Meredith reached for her slate in the lamplight and wrote, "You could not have stopped cholera. It was not your fault. And you will be an excellent father. I see how gentle you are, how patient. Our child is lucky to have you." "I am lucky to have you," Thomas said, kissing her forehead. "Both of you. This whole second chance." The baby kicked hard against his palm as if agreeing, and they both laughed. Christmas came, their first as a married couple and the last before becoming parents. They spent a quiet day at home, eating the ham misses Hutchinson had sent with them and exchanging small gifts. Thomas gave Meredith a music box he had ordered from San Francisco, carved with flowers and playing a soft lullaby. Meredith gave him a new shirt she had sewn, embroidered with his initials. "Next Christmas, there will be 3 of us," Thomas said, looking at her enormous belly with wonder. "A whole family." Meredith smiled and wrote, "A whole family, I never thought I would have that again." "Me neither," Thomas admitted. "But here we are, building something beautiful from what we thought was gone forever." January arrived with cold winds and the rare possibility of snow. Meredith was huge and uncomfortable, waiting impatiently for the baby to arrive. Sarah Brennan moved into their spare room the first week of January, ready to assist when labor started. It began on a Tuesday morning just before dawn. Meredith woke to cramping pain and shook Thomas awake. His eyes flew open, instantly alert. "Is it time?" She nodded, fear and excitement warring in her chest. The labor was long and difficult. Meredith could not cry out, could not vocalize her pain, which made everything harder. She gripped Thomas's hand until she thought she might break his fingers, her face contorted with silent agony. Thomas stayed beside her the entire time, wiping her face with cool cloths, whispering encouragement, being her voice when she needed Sarah to know something. After 14 hours, as the sun was setting on that January day, their baby finally arrived. Sarah caught the infant with practiced hands and announced, "A boy, a healthy baby boy." The baby let out a lusty cry, and Meredith burst into tears of relief and joy. Sarah cleaned the infant and placed him in Meredith's arms. He was red and wrinkled and absolutely perfect, with a fuzz of light hair and eyes that looked like they might be blue. Thomas stared at his son with an expression of such awe and love that Meredith felt her heart might burst. "He is beautiful," Thomas whispered. "Meredith, he is so beautiful." She nodded, unable to look away from the tiny face. She had made this. She and Thomas had created this perfect little person. From loss and grief, they had somehow created life. "What should we name him?" Thomas asked, gently touching the baby's small hand. The infant immediately gripped his finger with surprising strength. Meredith had thought about this for months. She wrote awkwardly, the baby cradled in one arm, "Samuel Thomas Jensen, for both our fathers." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "Samuel Thomas Jensen," he repeated. "Hello, Samuel. Welcome to the world, son." Little Samuel yawned, already looking sleepy, and Meredith felt a surge of fierce love so strong it was almost painful. This child, their son, represented everything good that had come from tragedy. He was hope made flesh, proof that life continued even after devastating loss. The first weeks with a newborn were exhausting and chaotic. Samuel was a good baby overall, but he still needed to eat every few hours and cried when he was hungry or needed changing. Meredith was grateful that she could not speak, because it meant she could not complain about the bone-deep tiredness that came with motherhood. Thomas was a devoted father, helping with everything despite his inexperience. He changed diapers and walked the floor with Samuel when he was fussy and sang old cowboy songs in his rough baritone to soothe the baby to sleep. Watching him with their son, Meredith fell in love with him all over again. Mrs. Hutchinson visited often, bringing food and helping with household chores so Meredith could rest. "He is a beautiful baby," she cooed, holding Samuel with the expertise of someone who had raised children of her own. "And you two are natural parents." By March, they had settled into a rhythm. Samuel was sleeping longer stretches at night, and Meredith was recovering her energy. Thomas had quit the mine entirely, focusing on building their ranch. The cattle herd had grown, and they had plans to expand further. One evening, as spring returned to the valley and the world turned green again, Meredith sat on the porch nursing Samuel. Thomas sat beside her, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. Meredith looked at him, at their son, at the home they had built together. She nodded emphatically. "Good," Thomas said, "because I am happier than I ever thought I would be again. You and Samuel, this life we have built, it is more than I deserve." Meredith shifted Samuel to one arm and reached for her slate. She wrote, "You deserve every bit of happiness, and so do I. We both lost everything, but we found each other. We built this." Thomas read her words and smiled. "We did we not? Two broken people who somehow made each other whole." Samuel finished nursing and made a small, contented sound. Meredith adjusted her dress and held him against her shoulder, patting his back gently. He was growing so fast, changing every day. His eyes had settled into blue like his father's, and he was starting to smile real smiles of recognition when he saw his parents. "You think about your voice much?" Thomas asked. "Wonder if it will ever come back?" Meredith considered the question. It had been a year and a half since that terrible night. Her voice had been gone so long now that she barely remembered what it sounded like. She wrote, "Sometimes, but mostly I have learned to live without it. We communicate fine. And Samuel will learn both ways, spoken words from you and sign language from me. He will be bilingual," Thomas joked. "But seriously, if it never comes back, we will manage. We already are managing." That night, after Samuel was asleep in his cradle and Thomas was snoring softly beside her, Meredith lay awake thinking about her voice. In some ways, its loss defined her. It was the physical manifestation of her trauma, the outward sign of everything she had endured. But it was also no longer the most important thing about her. She was a wife, a mother, a rancher. She was loved and loving. Her silence was just one part of who she was, not the entirety of her identity. She touched her throat gently, that place where words used to live, and felt only peace. Maybe someday her voice would return. Maybe it would not. Either way, she would be all right. She had Thomas. She had Samuel. She had a home and a life and a future. That was more than enough. Summer brought prosperity to the little ranch. The cattle thrived on the good grass, and Thomas sold several calves for a tidy profit. They used the money to make more improvements, buying proper furniture and replacing worn-out tools. Meredith planted a larger garden and began canning vegetables for winter. Life was full and busy and good. Samuel grew like a weed, hitting every milestone right on schedule. He rolled over, then sat up, then began crawling with determined speed. He babbled constantly, making sounds that were not quite words yet but would be soon. Meredith watched him with wonder, marveling at how quickly he was developing. In August, on the second anniversary of her parents' deaths, Meredith walked up to their memorial crosses again. This time she carried Samuel, who was nearly 8 months old and fascinated by everything. She stood before the crosses and introduced her son to the grandparents he would never meet. "This is Samuel," she told them in her heart. "Your grandson. He is healthy and happy and so loved. I wish you could hold him, could watch him grow. But I carry you both with me, and I will tell Samuel about you. He will know his grandfather Samuel, who he is named for. He will know his grandmother Catherine. I promise you that." Samuel reached for the wooden crosses with chubby hands, and Meredith let him touch them, connecting him physically to the family history he would only ever know through stories. Thomas found her there an hour later. He took Samuel without comment, letting Meredith have her time alone with her grief. It was smaller now, worn smooth by time and healing, but it would never disappear entirely. She had made peace with that. Grief was the price of love, and she would not trade the love she had for her parents, even to avoid the pain of losing them. As fall approached, Samuel began pulling himself up on furniture, preparing to walk. Thomas began teaching him words, pointing to objects and naming them. "Mama," he would say, pointing to Meredith. "Papa," pointing to himself. "Horse, cow, dog." Samuel absorbed it all with bright-eyed interest, and Meredith felt a pang of sadness that she could not teach him words the traditional way. But then Samuel would look at her and smile, reaching for her with perfect trust, and she knew it did not matter. He loved her completely, silence and all. One October evening, Thomas came in from working cattle with an excited expression. "I met our new neighbors today. Family named Morgan bought the old Peterson place about 5 miles south. They have a daughter around Samuel's age." Meredith wrote, "That is good. Samuel will need friends as he grows." "They invited us for supper next Sunday," Thomas continued. "I said we would come. It will be good to have neighbors close by, people to rely on if we need help." Sunday arrived clear and mild. Meredith dressed Samuel in his best clothes and packed a pie to bring. The ride to the Morgan ranch took about 30 minutes, through pretty country dotted with juniper and sage. The Morgan family turned out to be friendly and welcoming. Jim and Martha Morgan had 3 children, a teenage son, a daughter around Samuel's age named Alice, and a baby boy. Martha was delighted to meet another mother with young children in the area. "It gets lonely out here," she said as they watched Samuel and Alice play together on a blanket, both babies fascinated by each other. "We moved from Nevada last month, and I have been missing female company." Thomas explained Meredith's situation, and to her relief, Martha took it in stride. "However you communicate is fine with me," she said warmly. "I am just happy to have a friend nearby." They fell into an easy pattern of visiting back and forth. Martha did not mind Meredith's slate and became quite good at reading her handwriting. Alice and Samuel played together, and Meredith enjoyed having another woman to talk to, someone who understood the particular challenges and joys of motherhood. Winter came gently that year, with mild temperatures and occasional rain rather than snow. Samuel celebrated his first birthday in January with a small party attended by the Morgans, Mrs. Hutchinson, and a few other friends they had made. He smashed his face into a cake Meredith had baked and laughed with pure joy, covered in frosting. "He is so much like you," Thomas told Meredith that night after Samuel was asleep. "Happy despite everything, resilient, strong," she wrote. "He is like both of us, your eyes, my smile, we made someone wonderful." "We did," Thomas agreed. "And I have been thinking, maybe we should think about giving him a brother or sister. I know Samuel is still young, but I would like a big family if you do." Meredith considered this. The thought of another pregnancy, another birth, was daunting. But the thought of Samuel having siblings, of their home full of children and noise and life, was appealing. She wrote, "Let us not prevent it and see what happens. If it is meant to be, it will be." "Sounds perfect," Thomas said, pulling her close. As it turned out, it was meant to be. By March, Meredith was pregnant again, due in late fall. Thomas was delighted, already imagining a house full of children. Samuel was walking now, toddling around the house with increasing confidence and chattering in a mix of real words and babble. One morning in April, something unexpected happened. Meredith was in the kitchen making breakfast when Samuel toddled over and fell, bumping his head on the table leg. He let out a wail of pain and shock. Without thinking, reacting purely on instinct, Meredith opened her mouth and said, "Samuel." The word came out rough and hoarse, her vocal cords rusty from disuse, but it was there. It was real. She had spoken. Meredith froze in shock, one hand pressed to her throat. Samuel stopped crying, startled by the sound. Thomas, who had been outside feeding the horses, came running at the commotion. "What happened?" I heard. He stopped, staring at Meredith. "Did you just speak? Did I hear you speak?" Meredith opened her mouth, tried again. "Samuel," she croaked out. "He fell." Thomas's eyes went wide. "Meredith." "Oh my God, Meredith, you are talking." Your voice came back. She tried to say something else, but her throat seized up, the words sticking. She made a frustrated sound and reached for her slate, but Thomas stopped her. "Wait. Do not write. Try again, just slowly." She swallowed, her throat feeling strange and tight. He fell. It came out." The words were halting and raspy, but they were words, real spoken words from her mouth. Tears streamed down her face as nearly 2 years of pent-up voice tried to escape all at once. Thomas pulled her into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. "Your voice came back. I cannot believe it. What made it come back, Samuel?" Meredith managed, her voice getting slightly stronger with use. "He was hurt. I needed to call him. It just happened." She picked up Samuel, who was fine aside from a small bump on his forehead, and held him close. "My baby," she whispered into his hair. "I can call your name. I can sing to you." Over the following days and weeks, Meredith's voice gradually strengthened. At first, she could only manage a few words at a time before her throat got tired. But with practice, it came back more fully. The doctor in Cerro Gordo, when he examined her, said it was not uncommon for psychological mutism to resolve suddenly, often triggered by a strong emotional response. "Your son's cry broke through whatever barrier was holding your voice hostage," he explained. "Maternal instinct is a powerful thing." Meredith spent hours just talking, reveling in the ability to vocalize again. She talked to Thomas, to Samuel, to the horses and chickens. She sang lullabies she remembered from childhood. She read stories aloud, loving the sound of her own voice after so long without it. "It is different than I expected," she told Thomas one night. "I thought I would be completely happy, but part of me feels strange. My silence became part of who I am. Now I have to relearn how to be someone with a voice." "You are still you," Thomas assured her. "Voice or no voice. You are still the strong, resilient woman I fell in love with. This is just one more layer of you, not a replacement." He was right, as he often was. Having her voice back did not erase the nearly 2 years she had spent silent. Those experiences had shaped her, taught her things about communication and listening and presence that she might never have learned otherwise. She was grateful for her voice, but she was also grateful for what her silence had taught her. Summer passed in a blur of activity. The ranch continued to prosper, and Samuel grew into a bright, energetic toddler who never seemed to stop moving or asking questions. Meredith's pregnancy progressed normally, and she delighted in being able to tell Thomas how she was feeling rather than writing it down. In November, on a cold morning when frost painted the windows white, their second child arrived. The labor was shorter this time, only 6 hours, and when the baby emerged, the midwife announced, "A girl. You have a beautiful daughter." The baby girl had dark hair like her mother and lungs that worked perfectly, announcing her arrival with lusty cries. Meredith held her daughter and felt overwhelmed with love and gratitude. Thomas looked at his daughter with tears streaming down his face. "She looks like Lily did," he whispered. "Same dark hair, Same little nose, but she is her own person, our daughter." They named her Caroline Rose Jensen, after Thomas's first wife and Meredith's mother, Catherine. It felt right to honor the women they had lost while celebrating this new life. Samuel was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to touch her gently and bring her toys. Meredith watched her son with his sister and felt her heart swell. This was what healing looked like. Not forgetting the past or pretending the pain never happened, but building something new and beautiful despite it. The years that followed were full and rich. The ranch grew into a successful operation, providing well for their growing family. Samuel started school in Cerro Gordo, riding into town with Thomas each day. Caroline grew into a sweet, gentle child who loved animals and helping her mother in the garden. 2 more children followed. Another boy they named James, and finally another girl, Elizabeth. Their house, which had started so empty and worn, was now filled with noise and laughter and the chaos of 4 children. Meredith never took her voice for granted again. She used it to sing to her children, to tell them stories, to say, "I love you" to her husband. But she also remembered the lessons of her silence. She listened more than she talked. She paid attention to what people did not say as much as what they did. And when her children were upset or hurt, she sat with them in quiet companionship, knowing that sometimes presence mattered more than words. On the 10th anniversary of her parents' deaths, Meredith walked up to their memorial with all 4 children. They were old enough now to understand, and she told them about their grandparents, about the homestead near Randsburg, about the terrible night that had changed everything. "I lost my voice that night," she told them, Samuel now 12 and listening intently. "I could not speak for almost 2 years. I thought I would never talk again." "What made it come back?" Caroline asked, 8 years old and curious about everything. Meredith smiled. "Your brother. He fell and hurt himself, and I called his name without thinking. My voice came back because I needed it to protect my child." Love broke through the silence. "That is beautiful, Mama," Elizabeth said, only 4 but already wise beyond her years. "It is," Meredith agreed, "but the silence was important too. It taught me things I needed to learn. And it led me to your father." She looked at Thomas, who stood slightly apart with James on his shoulders. He met her eyes and smiled, that same smile that had first made her feel seen all those years ago in the boarding house. That evening, after the children were asleep, Meredith and Thomas sat on their porch watching the stars. It was a warm August night and the crickets sang in the darkness. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked. "Marrying me, coming here, building this life?" "Never," Meredith said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You saved me, Thomas. When I had lost everything, you saw me. You understood my silence. You loved me anyway. This life, our children, everything we have built, it is more than I ever dreamed I could have again." "You saved me too," Thomas said quietly. "I was just drifting, waiting to die until I met you. You gave me a reason to stop running, to put down roots, to live instead of just existing. We saved each other." Meredith leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, listening to his heartbeat. It was true. They had saved each other, 2 broken people who had somehow made each other whole. "I love you," she said, words she would never tire of speaking. "I will love you all my days." "And I love you," Thomas replied, kissing the top of her head. Voice and silence, now and always. They sat together in the quiet night, surrounded by the life they had built, the family they had made, the love that had grown from tragedy. Meredith thought about the girl she had been, standing silent over her parents' graves, thinking her life was over. She wished she could tell that girl that it was not over, that it was just beginning, that she would find love and home and happiness again, that she would survive and even thrive. But that girl would learn it in time, just as Meredith had. One day, one word, one moment of hope at a time. Because that was how healing worked. Not all at once, but gradually, like spring returning to the desert, transforming the harsh landscape into something beautiful and green and alive with possibility. Inside the house, one of the children stirred and called out. Meredith rose to check on them, grateful she could answer their call with words, with presence, with the love that had carried her through the darkest times and into this bright, full life. She had lost everything once, but she had found it again in different forms in unexpected places. She had lost her voice the night she lost everything. A cowboy had read her silence like a prayer, and together they had built something worth living for.